at 6 in the morning. Standing in front of my house was a woman in a ridiculously bright pajama set, holding a bucket of yellow paint, standing still like she was preparing for some kind of ritual. Then she splashed the paint straight onto my solar panels, huge chunks like she was killing something. I couldn't get a word out. She turned around to look at me, smiling. A kind of smile I'd never seen at any HOA meeting before. I didn't scream, didn't rush toward her. I just stood there and knew one thing for certain. Today wasn't going to end peacefully. Something couldn't be taken back. Have you ever witnessed vandalism so outrageous it left you speechless? Tell me about it in the comments below, because this story isn't what you think it is. My name is Clayton Reeves, and 6 months ago I thought moving to Pine Ridge Community in Denver would be the fresh start I needed. As a consulting engineer specializing in electrical systems for outdoor museums, I'd worked with California's energy companies long enough to know the value of sustainable power. When I saw the beautiful suburban neighborhood with its perfectly manicured lawns and friendly homeowners association, I figured it was the perfect place to install my dream solar panel system. $25,000 of cutting-edge technology that would not only power my home, but contribute something meaningful to the community. What I didn't expect was to become the target of the most controlling HOA president I'd ever encountered. The installation took 3 weeks, and from day one I noticed something unsettling. Every morning when I stepped outside in my tech-forward soft-shell jacket and solar-powered running shoes, I could feel eyes watching me from behind curtains and through kitchen windows. Mrs. Henderson from across the street would pause her morning jog to stare. The Johnsons next door suddenly found reasons to water their already perfect lawn whenever I was outside. Even the mailman started asking questions about all that fancy equipment going up on my roof. It felt like living in a fishbowl, but I convinced myself it was just curiosity about new technology. Then Janine Wilcox showed up. She arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was adjusting the final panel alignment, wearing her signature outfit that made her look like she just rolled out of bed, faded pajama pants, an oversized wool sweater with visible pills, and plastic gardening clogs that squeaked with every step. Her graying hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she carried a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that could cut glass, "but we need to talk about this situation." She gestured broadly at my solar array with the kind of disgust most people reserve for roadkill. I climbed down from the ladder, genuinely trying to be neighborly. "Hi there, I'm Clayton. Just moved in a few months ago. You must be from the HOA?" She didn't extend her hand for a shake, instead clutching that clipboard tighter. "Janine Wilcox, HOA president. And yes, we definitely need to discuss this eyesore you've created. This neighborhood has maintained certain standards since 1986, and these contraptions don't fit with our community aesthetic." I could hear the capital letters in her voice when she said community aesthetic, like it was some sacred doctrine. "Actually, they're not just helping me save money on electricity," I explained, keeping my tone friendly. "They're designed to help power the whole neighborhood's street lighting system too. Pretty cool, right?" The look she gave me could have frozen water in July. "Cool? Mr. Reeves, this is Pine Ridge, not some experimental commune in California. We have rules here, traditions that matter. These panels are a violation of everything this community stands for." Before I could respond, she was already scribbling something on her clipboard. "You'll be receiving official notice within 24 hours. I suggest you start making arrangements to remove these immediately." She turned and squeaked away in those ridiculous clogs, leaving me standing there with a wrench in my hand and a growing sense that my peaceful suburban dream was about to become a nightmare. That evening, I met my next-door neighbor Colleen Myers for the first time. She was a sharp-eyed real estate attorney in her late 30s, who'd apparently been watching the morning's confrontation from her kitchen window. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," she said with a wry smile, "where Janine Wilcox thinks she's running a historical preservation society instead of a homeowners association." We talked over the fence for nearly an hour, and she filled me in on Janine's history. Apparently, she'd been kicked out of her previous HOA position for overreach, and when she inherited her grandmother's house here 2 years ago, she'd immediately campaigned for the presidency. "The woman has serious control issues," Colleen warned. "But don't let her intimidate you. Your panels are completely legal, and frankly, this neighborhood could use some forward-thinking improvements." By the next morning, I understood what Janine meant by official notice. Every surface of my front gate was covered with bright yellow violation stickers. They were stuck to the metal posts, the wooden slats, even the mailbox. Each one read, AEST headache violation, immediate compliance required, in bold red letters. It looked like my property had been quarantined for some infectious disease. As I stood there pulling off sticker after sticker, I could see more curtains twitching and more neighbors pretending to check their mail while actually watching my reaction. The message was clear. Janine Wilcox was declaring war, and she wanted the whole neighborhood to know it. 3 days later, I received a formal invitation printed on HOA letterhead that looked like it had been designed in 1995. Emergency community meeting, mandatory attendance, Saturday 2 p.m., Wilcox residence backyard. The timing struck me as odd until I realized Janine had scheduled her power play during her monthly neighborhood barbecue. Nothing says democratic process like arguing about solar panels while people are trying to enjoy hamburgers and potato salad. Saturday afternoon arrived with typical Colorado sunshine, and I walked the 3 blocks to Janine's house with a folder full of permits, electrical specifications, and city approval documents. Her backyard was already packed with neighbors, most holding paper plates loaded with food from the smoking grill. The setup was almost comical. Folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle around a card table that served as Janine's official podium while she stood behind her barbecue grill wearing an apron over her usual disheveled outfit. Dale Ferguson, the neighborhood's electrical engineer and HOA board member, was flipping burgers while trying to look neutral. Colleen caught my eye and gave me an encouraging nod from her spot near the back. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency session," Janine announced, somehow managing to sound official while wielding a spatula. "We're here to address a serious threat to our community's character and property values. Mr. Reeves has installed an unauthorized industrial facility on his roof without proper community consultation." She gestured dramatically toward my house, which was barely visible through the trees. The HOA covenant from 2002 clearly states that any exterior modifications must maintain neighborhood harmony. Since solar panels weren't specifically mentioned, they fall under the prohibited category by default. I stood up, folder in hand, and tried to keep my voice level. "Actually, I have all the proper documentation right here. City permits, electrical certifications, and utility company approval. Everything was filed through proper channels before installation began." A few neighbors nodded approvingly, but Janine was already shaking her head. Before I could respond, Marge Dixon stood up. "I have video proof that Mr. Reeves was aggressive." She played a silent, choppy clip of me waving my arms. Edited and cropped, it looked like a man yelling, not explaining solar wiring. "We live here, not some bureaucrat downtown. These panels are an eyesore that affects everyone's property values." That's when things got interesting. Mrs. Marge Dixon, a 50-something woman I'd barely noticed before, suddenly stood up with her phone in hand. "I have video evidence of Mr. Reeves being aggressive and threatening during installation," she announced. "He clearly has no respect for community concerns." She started playing a heavily edited clip that showed me gesturing while talking to a contractor, but with no audio context. The way she'd cut it together, I looked like I was having some kind of angry outburst, when in reality I'd been explaining the electrical connections with enthusiasm. Dale Ferguson finally spoke up, setting down his burger-flipping duties. "Look, I've reviewed Clayton's installation professionally, and everything meets code. The panels are actually pretty impressive from a technical standpoint." But before he could continue, Janine slammed her spatula down on the grill so hard it made everyone jump. "Technical specifications aren't the issue here. This is about community values, about maintaining the character that makes Pine Ridge special. If we allow one person to ignore our standards, where does it end?" The crowd was clearly divided. Younger residents seemed intrigued by the solar technology, while older neighbors nodded along with Janine's community standards rhetoric. The discussion went in circles for another 30 minutes, with people talking over each other between bites of barbecue. Finally, Janine called for a formal vote, all in favor of requiring Mr. Reeves to remove his panels within 30 days. 5 hands went up. All opposed? 4 hands, including Colleen's and Dale's. Abstentions? 3 people refused to vote. The Martian was closer than Janine had expected, and I could see the frustration building in her face. She'd hoped for overwhelming community support, but instead got a split decision that barely favored her position. "The motion passes," she announced tersely, "but I want everyone to understand the seriousness of this situation. Mr. Reeves, you have 30 days to comply with community standards, or the HOA will be forced to take legal action." She turned back to the grill, aggressively flipping burgers like she was taking out her frustration on the meat. As the meeting broke up, several neighbors approached me quietly. Tom Chen, a software developer from down the street, whispered, Don't let her bully you, man. Half of us are just afraid to speak up. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow, patted my arm and said, "In my day, we celebrated innovation, not punished it." Even Dale Ferguson pulled me aside as I was leaving. "Clayton, between you and me, your system is exactly what this neighborhood needs. Don't give up without a fight." But it was Marge Dixon's behavior that really caught my attention. As I walked past her on the way out, I overheard her talking to Janine near the grill. "Don't worry, I'm keeping detailed records of everything he does. We'll have plenty of evidence if this goes to court." The way she said it, with such vindictive satisfaction, made my skin crawl. I realized Janine wasn't just a control freak. She had recruited a spy network. Walking home, I felt a mix of determination and dread. The vote had been close enough to show I had community support, but Janine's reaction told me this was far from over. As I reached my front gate, I noticed something that made me pause. All those violation stickers from earlier in the week were gone, but now there were small chalk marks on the mailbox post, the kind real estate agents use to mark properties. Someone had been taking notes about my house, and I had a pretty good idea who. The business trip to Phoenix came at exactly the wrong time, but I couldn't postpone the museum consultation I'd been planning for months. 3 days away from Pine Ridge meant 3 days of not being able to monitor Janine's next move, but I figured even she wouldn't be bold enough to do anything drastic while I was gone. I should have known better. I flew back into Denver on Friday night and drove straight home, exhausted but looking forward to sleeping in my own bed. 6 o'clock Saturday morning, I stumbled outside in my pajamas to grab the newspaper, and the sight that greeted me will be burned into my memory forever. My pristine 12-panel solar array, which had been gleaming black and silver just 3 days earlier, was now a dripping mess of neon yellow paint. Not just splattered, completely coated, like someone had used a paint sprayer to ensure every inch was covered. The excess paint had run down the roof tiles and pooled on the ground below, creating abstract yellow puddles that looked like crime scene evidence. But the real shock was Janine herself, standing in my front yard like she was admiring her handiwork. She was wearing the most ridiculous outfit I'd ever seen. Bright purple pajama pants covered in cartoon cats, a neon green tank top that clashed horribly, and those same squeaky plastic clogs. Her hair was still in yesterday's messy bun, and she had yellow paint streaks on her arms and face. In one hand, she held her phone, apparently live streaming the entire scene. In the other hand, she held a stack of official-looking papers. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves," she called out cheerfully, like we were discussing the weather. "I hope you had a pleasant trip. As you can see, the community has taken action to address the aesthetic concerns we discussed. Your panels are now much more visually appealing. That bright yellow really complements the neighborhood's sunny disposition, don't you think?" She held up her phone, speaking directly into the camera. "Folks, this is what happens when people refuse to respect community standards. Sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands." I stood there in my pajamas, arms crossed, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain was cataloging evidence. The empty 5-gallon paint bucket lying on its side near my driveway. The paint-covered gardening gloves scattered around. The obvious footprints leading from the street to my house. But the emotional part of my brain was struggling between rage and disbelief. This woman had vandalized $25,000 worth of equipment and was literally broadcasting her crime to the internet. "You can't be serious," I finally managed to say, my voice barely controlled. "You painted over my solar panels. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Janine lowered her phone and smiled that same disturbing smile I'd seen on the first day. "I've solved a community problem, Mr. Reeves. These panels no longer violate our aesthetic standards. In fact, I think the yellow is quite cheerful." She walked over and placed a stack of papers under my windshield wiper. "You'll find violation notices for each panel, $500 per panel, totaling $6,000 in fines for refusing to comply with the 30-day removal notice." What made the scene even more surreal was that Janine wasn't trying to hide what she'd done. She was actively documenting it, talking to her phone camera like she was hosting a home improvement show. Watching her explain her process like a twisted Bob Ross tutorial, I wasn't just furious. I was gutted. Those panels weren't just tech to me, they were hope. They were proof that my ideals could live beside white fences and BBQ grills. The casual way she discussed destroying my property while wearing cartoon cat pajamas was so bizarre, it felt like I was trapped in some kind of fever dream. I pulled out my own phone and started recording, which seemed to annoy her for the first time. "Mr. Reeves, there's no need for dramatics. This is simply community enforcement of existing standards. Perhaps if you'd been more cooperative during the original 30-day period, She gestured broadly at the yellow-coated panels, accidentally flicking paint from her gloves onto her own pajamas. The HOA board has full authority to address violations through appropriate remediation measures. That's when I noticed Marge Dixon lurking near the edge of my property with her own phone, clearly recording everything from multiple angles. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. She was positioned to capture both Janine's official statement and my reaction. The coordination was obvious. This wasn't a spontaneous act of vandalism. It was a planned operation with documentation and backup support. They'd turned community destruction into performance art. "You've just committed thousands of dollars in property damage," I said, still recording. "This is vandalism, and it's going straight to the police and my insurance company." Janine's confident smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Mr. Reeves, I think you'll find that HOA enforcement actions are protected under community covenant agreements. We're simply ensuring compliance with established standards. Perhaps you should have read the fine print before installing your equipment." The most infuriating part was how she kept referring to my state-of-the-art solar installation as equipment or contraptions, like I'd installed some kind of industrial machinery instead of clean energy technology. Standing there in the morning sun, looking at my paint-coated panels and this woman in cartoon cat pajamas live streaming her vandalism, I realized Janine Wilcox had just made the biggest mistake of her. She thought she was teaching me a lesson about community compliance. What she'd actually done was give me everything I needed to teach her a lesson about consequences. By Monday morning, I had documentation that would make any attorney salivate. Photos from every angle, video of Janine's live-streamed confession, witness statements from 3 neighbors who'd seen the paint job happen, and receipts for every piece of damaged equipment. My insurance company was appalled, the police took statements, and my attorney was practically rubbing his hands together with glee. It seemed like an open and shut case of vandalism and property destruction. But Janine Wilcox hadn't gotten to be HOA president by backing down from fights. When I served her with papers demanding $25,000 in damages plus cleanup costs, she responded by filing her own lawsuit against me for community harassment and intimidation. According to her complaint, I had been aggressively promoting unauthorized installations and creating a hostile environment for community leadership. Somehow, Marge Dixon had provided an entire folder of evidence, photos of me talking to contractors, recordings of phone conversations taken from outside my house, and even a log of my daily activities that read like surveillance reports. "This is insane," I told Colleen over coffee at her kitchen table. "She vandalized my property, live-streamed herself doing it, and now she's claiming I'm the one causing problems." Colleen leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Marge, I'm digging into her past. You're not the first neighbor she's obsessively filmed. There's a harassment claim against her in Aurora 3 years ago, filed by a mailman." Colleen, with her real estate law experience, was less optimistic than my attorney. "Clayton, HOA disputes get weird fast. Even when someone is clearly in the wrong, they can drag these cases out for years. Janine knows that your legal costs will add up, and she's betting you'll settle rather than fight." That night I stared at the footage of her, frame by frame, her phone pointed at my yard like I was a criminal. For the first time, I seriously considered quitting. Maybe Pine Ridge wasn't worth the fight. That's when Colleen made a suggestion that changed everything. If Janine really wants to play hardball, maybe it's time the whole community saw the consequences of her actions. "You mentioned your panels don't just power your house, they're part of some larger system, right? Maybe people need to understand exactly what she damaged when she painted over your installation." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on the financial damage that I hadn't really thought about the broader implications of what Janine had done. Dale Ferguson finally agreed to meet with me privately, away from Janine's influence and Marge's surveillance. We sat in his garage workshop, surrounded by electrical diagnostic equipment, and I could see he was genuinely conflicted. "Clayton, I've been doing electrical work in this neighborhood for 15 years. What Janine did was completely out of line. But she's got half the community convinced you're some kind of troublemaker. The board is split, and honestly, most people just want this whole thing to go away." "Dale, you understand the technical side of this better than anyone," I pressed. "Help me explain to people what my system actually does for the community." He was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out a folder of his own. "Okay, here's what I know. Your solar installation isn't just a residential system. It's part of a pilot program with the city's electrical utility. Those panels generate excess power that feeds directly into the neighborhood's street lighting grid. The way it's set up, your system basically subsidizes the entire community's outdoor lighting costs." This was the piece I'd been missing. When I'd signed the paperwork 6 months earlier, I knew my excess power would feed back into the grid, but I hadn't fully understood the specific arrangement. So when Janine painted over my panels, I started. She didn't just damage your property, Dale finished. She cut off the supplemental power supply for every streetlight in Pine Ridge. The system has backup batteries that'll keep things running for about 72 hours, but after that, he shrugged. Well, let's just say the community might start understanding exactly how valuable your eyesore really is. The timeline was perfect. Janine had painted my panels on Saturday morning, which meant the backup power would run out sometime Tuesday evening. It was already Monday afternoon, which gave me less than 30 hours to decide whether to warn the community or let them discover the consequences naturally. Dale, if the streetlights go out, how long would it take to get them back online? He thought for a moment. Assuming your panels can be cleaned and brought back to full capacity, maybe 24 hours after the paint is removed. But that's assuming there's no permanent damage to the photovoltaic cells. That evening, I sat in my living room staring at my damaged solar array through the window, weighing my options. I could clean the paint off immediately and restore power before anyone noticed the connection. I could warn the HOA board about the impending blackout and use it as leverage in our legal dispute, or I could let events play out naturally and allow the community to experience the full consequences of Janine's vandalism. Colleen's words kept echoing in my mind. Maybe it's time the whole community saw the consequences of her actions. I made my decision around midnight Monday. The paint would stay exactly where Janine had put it, at least until Tuesday night. If she wanted to play power games with the HOA, it was time she learned what real power looked like. I spent Tuesday morning researching paint removal techniques and calling contractors for damage estimates, but I made no moves to actually restore my system. Every time I looked outside and saw those yellow-coated panels, I reminded myself that justice sometimes requires patience. By Tuesday evening, I could barely contain my anticipation. I'd calculated that the backup batteries would start failing around 9 p.m., beginning with the streetlights farthest from the main power grid. The lights closest to my house, the ones most directly connected to my solar array, would probably last until around 10:30. I made myself a cup of coffee, settled into my front window, and waited for Janine Wilcox to learn her first lesson in cause and effect. Tuesday night arrived with typical suburban tranquility. Families were finishing dinner, kids were doing homework, and the automatic streetlights flickered on, right on schedule, as the sun set behind the mountains. I sat by my front window with my coffee, watching the familiar evening routine play out across Pine Ridge. Dog walkers emerged for their nightly routes, joggers started their evening runs, and teenagers gathered at the corner park under the bright LED streetlights that had illuminated our community for the past 6 months. 9:15 p.m. came and went without incident. I started wondering if my calculations were wrong, if maybe the backup system had more capacity than Dale had estimated. Then, at 9:23, the first light went out. It was the streetlight at the far end of Maple Street, nearly half a mile from my house. Just a single dark spot in the otherwise well-lit neighborhood, easy to dismiss as a burned-out bulb or minor electrical glitch. Most people probably didn't even notice. But I noticed, and more importantly, I knew what was coming next. Over the next hour, it was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The streetlights failed in a predictable pattern, starting from the edges of the neighborhood and working inward toward the central grid connection near my house. Street after street dimmed out, like a neighborhood-wide, power-down animation. At 10:50, someone screamed outside. I ran out to see Mr. Polk, the veteran from 2 houses down, lying in his driveway. He had tripped on a sprinkler head trying to get to his mailbox with a flashlight. His daughter knelt beside him, shaking, dialing 911. 10:21, half of the main thoroughfare went black, causing the first concerned phone calls to the utility company. That's when the real show started. My doorbell rang at 10:25, and I opened it to find Mrs. Henderson from across the street looking panicked. "Clayton, are you having power problems? Our streetlights are going out one by one, and the utility company says there's no outage in our area." I stepped outside and made a show of looking around at the growing patches of darkness spreading through Pine Ridge like some kind of slow-motion blackout plague. That's strange. My house power is fine, but you're right about the streetlights, probably just a grid maintenance issue. By 10:45, nearly 2/3 of the neighborhood streetlights were dead, and my phone was ringing constantly. Neighbors were calling each other, creating informal phone trees to track which areas still had lighting and which had gone dark. Someone started a group chat that was pinging with updates every few minutes. Two guys were whispering near the mailboxes. "You think it's him? The engineer? What if he sabotaged us on purpose? Revenge for the vote." Their eyes drifted to my window. I ducked back instinctively. The community was experiencing something it hadn't faced since moving to this upscale development, genuine uncertainty about basic infrastructure. At 11 p.m. sharp, the final streetlight went out. Pine Ridge community, with its perfect lawns and million-dollar homes, was now illuminated solely by porch lights and the occasional flashlight beam. The transformation was dramatic. What had been a safe, well-lit suburban enclave suddenly felt isolated and vulnerable during one of their own. I could see neighbors gathering in small groups on sidewalks, sharing flashlights and trying to make sense of the situation. That's when Janine made her first appearance of the evening. I watched through my window as she emerged from her house, wearing the same cartoon cat pajamas from Saturday morning, now carrying a heavy-duty flashlight and her ever-present clipboard. She marched down the street like a general surveying a battlefield, stopping to talk with clusters of concerned residents. Even from a distance, I could see her animated gestures and hear her raised voice carrying across the unusually quiet neighborhood. My phone rang again, and this time it was Dale Ferguson. "Clayton, I'm getting calls from half the neighborhood about the streetlight situation. The utility company is telling everyone there's no equipment failure on their end, which means..." He paused, and I could hear the realization in his voice. "The backup batteries for your solar feed just died, didn't they?" I kept my voice carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dale. My panels have been non-functional since Saturday when they got painted over. Are you saying there's some connection to the streetlight grid?" "You know exactly what I mean," he said, but without anger. "Clayton, people are starting to panic out here. Mrs. Patterson fell down her front steps because she couldn't see properly. The teenagers in the park are using their phone flashlights to get home safely. This is getting serious." I could hear the conflict in his voice. He understood what was happening and why, but he was also watching his neighbors struggle with the consequences of Janine's actions. "Dale, I'm just one homeowner dealing with vandalized property. If there's some connection between my damaged solar panels and the community lighting system, maybe that's something the HOA should have considered before allowing members to destroy private property." The words felt calculated as I said them, but they were also completely true. Janine had painted over my panels without understanding what they actually did for the community. At 11:30, I watched Janine's flashlight beam approach my front door. She rang the doorbell with sharp, aggressive bursts that matched her personality perfectly. When I opened the door, she was practically vibrating with fury, still wearing those ridiculous pajamas, but now accessorized with a headlamp that made her look like an angry spelunker. "Mr. Reeves, we need to talk. Right now." "Good evening, Janine. Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" I stepped outside, noting how the darkness made even my familiar front yard feel different and uncertain. "I suppose you're here about the streetlight situation?" Her headlamp beam swung wildly as she gestured toward the darkened neighborhood. "Don't play dumb with me. I know your panels are connected to our lighting system somehow. This blackout started right after She stopped herself, apparently realizing she was about to confess to vandalism again. "After you what, Janine?" I asked innocently. "After you painted over my solar panels? The ones that you said were just ugly eyesores that needed to be removed?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications. The woman who had live-streamed herself destroying my property was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences beyond the immediate satisfaction of getting your way. "Fix this," she said finally. "Whatever you need to do to get those lights back on, do it. Tonight." I looked around at the dark streets, at the neighbors still wandering around with flashlights, at the community that had allowed its HOA president to vandalize my property without consequences. "Janine, I'd love to help, but as you can see, my solar panels are covered in paint. They've been non-functional since Saturday morning when someone vandalized them. Perhaps you could check with whoever did that and ask them to fix the damage they caused." Wednesday morning dawned on a Pine Ridge community unlike anything residents had ever experienced. What should have been another routine suburban morning was instead a mixture of confusion, frustration, and growing anger as people realized the streetlight blackout wasn't a temporary glitch. Children walked to school bus stops, guided by parents with flashlights. Morning joggers stumbled over uneven sidewalks they'd navigated safely for years. The elderly residents who depended on well-lit streets for their evening walks were effectively trapped in their homes after sunset. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. with calls from neighbors, utility company representatives, and even a reporter from the local news station who'd heard about the mysterious blackout in upscale Pine Ridge. I let most of them go to voicemail, but I did answer when Colleen called around 7:30. Clayton, this is getting bigger than just a neighborhood dispute. The utility company is sending engineers out this morning to investigate the grid failure. Are you ready for what happens when they figure out the connection to your panels? I was more than ready. In fact, I'd been up since 5 a.m., making sure I had all my documentation organized. The original installation permits, the utility company agreement, photos of the painted panels, and video of Janine's live-streamed vandalism. Colleen, I think it's time the whole community understood exactly what they lost when their HOA president decided to take matters into her own hands. The utility company engineers arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. 2 technicians in a white truck marked Denver Power and Light, who spent the first hour driving slowly through the neighborhood, checking transformer connections and testing power lines. Utility trucks rolled by slowly, their lights casting long shadows on puzzled porches. Near the curb, 2 neighbors argued. "This is the city's fault," one snapped. The other, glancing toward my house, whispered, "What if it's him? What if the engineer sabotaged us to make a point? Equals, dot." It was like watching detectives at a crime scene methodically gathering evidence. Around 10:30, one of the technicians knocked on my door. He was a middle-aged man named Rick who introduced himself as the senior electrical engineer for this district. "Mr. Reeves, we're investigating a complete failure of the LED streetlight system in this neighborhood. Our records show your property has a grid-tied solar installation that feeds excess power into the community lighting circuit. Mind if we take a look at your system?" I led Rick and his partner around to the backyard where they could see my solar array in all its yellow-painted glory. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. "Jesus Christ," Rick muttered, staring up at the painted panels. "Someone painted over your entire array? When did this happen?" I handed him a folder with photos, timestamps, and Janine's own livestream video. Saturday morning. The HOA president decided my panels were aesthetically inappropriate, so she took community enforcement into her own hands. Rick looked up at the panels, frozen. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Someone did this on purpose?" He snapped 3 photos fast. His partner was already on the radio. "This isn't just damage," Rick said, stepping back. "It's targeted. This array was feeding street power. This is sabotage." I handed him the folder with permits, video evidence, and the livestream transcript. He stared at the papers, then back at the panels. "We're calling this in," he said flatly. "Legal, city, maybe even state." He didn't explain the system to me. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what had been lost. Somebody painted over a 12-panel residential array that was providing backup power to the entire streetlight grid. The voice on the radio crackled back with something that sounded like profanity, followed by, "How long to restore service?" Rick looked at my painted panels and shook his head. "Depends on whether the photovoltaic cells are permanently damaged. Could be days, could be weeks." That's when things started moving fast. Rick called his supervisor, who called the utility company's legal department, who called the Denver City Attorney's office. Within 2 hours, my quiet suburban street was crawling with official vehicles, utility trucks, city inspectors, and even a police car. The investigation had grown from a neighborhood blackout into a case of infrastructure vandalism, with potential criminal charges. The real fireworks started when Rick decided he needed to interview Janine directly. I watched from my window as the utility engineers knocked on her door around noon. She answered wearing her usual disheveled outfit. Today's choice was paint-stained sweatpants and a t-shirt that read, "Community Pride," in faded letters. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Rick's conversation with Janine lasted about 15 minutes, during which her voice got progressively louder and more defensive. By 2 p.m., word had spread through the entire neighborhood that the streetlight outage was connected to my vandalized solar panels. Neighbors who'd been neutral or supportive of the HOA's position suddenly found themselves facing the reality that their community's infrastructure had been crippled by their own leadership. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to my door, some apologetic, some angry, all wanting to understand how their quiet suburban dispute had turned into a public utilities crisis. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who'd supported me at the BBQ meeting, arrived around 3 p.m. with tears in her eyes. "Clayton, I had no idea your panels were helping power our streetlights. I fell down my front steps last night because I couldn't see properly. If I'd known what Janine was really destroying..." she trailed off, shaking her head. I'm so sorry we let this happen to you. But the visit that really mattered came at 4 p.m., when Dale Ferguson showed up with Tom Chen and 3 other neighbors I recognized from the barbecue meeting. Clayton, Dale said formally, we need to call an emergency HOA meeting to address this situation. As board members, we're prepared to override Janine's authority and authorize immediate restoration of your solar system at community expense. Tom Chen nodded emphatically. This has gone way beyond property aesthetics. She's damaged critical infrastructure, and the whole neighborhood is paying the price. As evening approached, I could see neighbors throughout Pine Ridge preparing for their second night without streetlights. Flashlights appeared on porches, battery-powered lanterns illuminated driveways, and parents walked their children to friends' houses rather than letting them play outside after dark. The community that had allowed Janine to vandalize my property was now experiencing the consequences of her actions in the most direct way possible. At 7 p.m., my doorbell rang one more time. Through the peephole, I could see Janine standing on my front porch, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her were nearly 20 neighbors, many carrying flashlights or phone lights, creating an impromptu torch-bearing crowd that looked like something from a historical drama. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how different Janine looked. No longer confident and controlling, but genuinely shaken by the day's revelations. Mr. Reeves, she said, her voice lacking its usual authority, I think we need to discuss a solution to our community's lighting situation. The emergency HOA meeting that night was unlike anything Pine Ridge community had ever seen. Instead of Janine's usual barbecue backyard setup, we gathered in the community center with borrowed camping lanterns and battery-powered floodlights, creating dramatic shadows on the walls. The attendance was unprecedented. Nearly 40 residents packed into a space designed for 20. With people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The darkness outside made the meeting feel urgent and serious in a way that previous HOA gatherings never had. Dale Ferguson had taken charge of organizing the meeting, and he'd prepared carefully. A laptop connected to a portable projector displayed photos and documents on a white sheet hung on the wall. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we're here tonight because our community is facing a crisis that could have been easily avoided. Before we discuss solutions, I think everyone needs to understand exactly what happened and why we're sitting in the dark. The first image that appeared on the makeshift screen was my solar installation on the day it was completed. 12 gleaming black panels arranged in perfect rows, looking professional and modern against my roof tiles. 6 months ago, Clayton Reeves installed this state-of-the-art solar array after obtaining all proper permits and approvals, Dale explained. What most of you didn't know is that this system was part of a pilot program with Denver Power and Light to provide supplemental power for our neighborhood's LED streetlight grid. The next image was devastating in its simplicity. My panels coated in bright yellow paint, looking like a child's art project gone wrong. A collective gasp went up from the audience as people saw the vandalism, clearly documented. Saturday morning, these panels were painted over by someone who decided community aesthetics were more important than infrastructure functionality, Dale continued. The result is what we're all experiencing tonight, complete failure of our streetlight system. Then came the video evidence. Dale had connected my phone to the projector, and Janine's own live stream played on the wall for everyone to see. The footage was damning. There she was in her cartoon cat pajamas, cheerfully explaining to her online audience how she was solving a community problem by destroying my property. The room was dead silent as neighbors watched their HOA president commit vandalism while broadcasting it to the internet. I think we can all agree, Dale said as the video ended, that this situation has moved far beyond a simple aesthetic dispute. We're looking at criminal vandalism, destruction of critical infrastructure, and potential liability issues that could affect every property owner in Pine Ridge. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I could see Janine shrinking into her chair near the back of the room. Colleen stood up to address the legal implications. As a real estate attorney, I need to make everyone aware of the serious liability exposure we're facing. The utility company has already indicated they may seek damages for infrastructure disruption. If someone gets injured due to inadequate lighting, we could be looking at personal injury lawsuits. And if property values decline because of this incident, every homeowner here could suffer financial losses. That's when the community's anger really started to show. Tom Chen stood up, his voice shaking with frustration. I want to know how one person was allowed to make decisions that affected the entire neighborhood without any oversight or consultation. Where was the board? Where were the checks and balances? Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of complaints about Janine's unilateral decision-making and the lack of accountability in the HOA structure. Janine finally stood up, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the confident authority figure who dominated previous meetings. In her place was a woman who clearly understood that her actions had consequences far beyond what she'd imagined. "I want everyone to know that I was trying to protect our community's character and property values," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt or for our infrastructure to be damaged." "But you did intend to destroy Clayton's property," called out Mrs. Patterson from the front row. "You live-streamed yourself doing it. You were proud of what you did until you realized the consequences." The elderly woman's accusation hung in the air, and several people nodded in agreement. Janine had no response to that level of truth. Dale projected the final piece of evidence, the repair estimates I had obtained from 3 different solar contractors. The cost to restore Clayton's system ranges from $8,000 to $15,000, depending on whether the photovoltaic cells can be salvaged or need complete replacement. Additionally, the utility company is calculating damages for infrastructure disruption, which could add another $10,000 to $20,000 to our community's liability. The financial reality hit the room like a cold wave. People started doing quick math in their heads, calculating what these costs would mean for HOA fees and individual assessments. The woman who'd painted over my panels to protect property values had potentially cost every homeowner in Pine Ridge hundreds or thousands of dollars in additional expenses. Tom Chen made the motion that everyone was expecting. I move that Janine Wilcox be removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately, and that the board authorize full restoration of Clayton Reeves' solar system at community expense. The second came immediately from Mrs. Patterson, followed by calls for a vote from around the room. Dale called for the formal vote, and the result was overwhelming. 43 residents voted in favor of removing Janine from office. Only Marge Dixon abstained, apparently realizing her own role in the vandalism made her vote politically toxic. Janine herself didn't vote, instead gathering her things and walking out of the meeting without another word. But the community wasn't finished. As people began to disperse, several neighbors approached me with apologies and offers of support. "Clayton," said Mrs. Patterson, "I'd like to nominate you for HOA president. You've shown more leadership and integrity in this crisis than we've seen in years." The suggestion was met with immediate agreement from multiple people, and within minutes, I found myself reluctantly accepting a nomination I'd never expected. 3 weeks later, Pine Ridge community looked very different. My solar panels had been professionally cleaned and restored, with additional units installed on the community center to expand our renewable energy capacity. The streetlights were brighter than ever, and our monthly utility costs had dropped by 30%. Janine had moved out of the neighborhood, reportedly to a condo development with no HOA at all. Marge Dixon had quietly stopped her surveillance activities and become a surprisingly helpful neighbor. As I stood in my backyard one evening, watching the sun set over our well-lit community, Colleen joined me with 2 cups of coffee. "So, Mr. President," she said with a smile, "any regrets about the whole thing?" I looked at the solar panels gleaming on my roof, at the bright streetlights extending throughout our neighborhood, and at the community that had learned to value innovation over rigid control. "Only one regret," I said. "I should have installed twice as many panels from the beginning." The best part of the whole experience wasn't the vindication or even the justice of seeing consequences catch up with bad behavior. It was watching a community realize that progress and tradition don't have to be enemies, that innovation can actually strengthen the values we care about most. Pine Ridge had learned that sometimes the biggest threat to community standards isn't change. It's the refusal to adapt and grow together. And every time I see those gleaming solar panels on my roof, I'm reminded that the most powerful force in any community isn't the person trying to control everyone else. It's the quiet determination of people who refuse to give up on doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when it's expensive, and even when it means standing up to bullies who think their authority gives them the right to destroy what others have built.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.